Apple may have just sealed the iPad's fate, not because the iPad is bad, far from it. The hardware is excellent, almost irresponsibly good. And I know some of you may be asking, what does this graph even mean? Is this accurate at all? And look, you guys have been letting Apple get away with this for years, so don't ask me. The problem is that Apple is about to release something that threatens to do everything the iPad claims to do without begging for accessories or justification. I'm talking about the upcoming iPhone Fold. And if Apple pulls this off the way the rumors suggest, it doesn't just complicate the iPad's role, it actively undermines it. So today, I want to ask a question Apple seems unwilling to answer. What is the iPad supposed to be anymore when your phone can just turn into a tablet? Sub rotten. The iPad has always lived in an awkward middle space. It's not an iPhone, it's not a Mac, and after more than a decade, it still hasn't earned a clear identity. This isn't a video about whether the iPad is good though, it is, but that's part of the problem. The hardware is absurdly powerful, and it's wildly overqualified for the software it runs. Kind of like a race car stuck in school traffic. When the iPad launched, it made sense. It was just a big iPhone. It really was that simple. It was a couch computer, a device for reading, watching, browsing, and light work. It wasn't trying to replace anything. It just filled the gap. And then Apple decided the iPad needed to be more. Faster chips, Pro models, keyboard cases, trackpads, different pencils that can't replace one another, external displays, etc. Suddenly, a device designed for consumption is marketed as a productivity machine, except it still isn't allowed to behave like one. It can almost do everything, which means it fully satisfies nearly nothing. And Apple keeps pretending that almost is enough. Accessories expose this better than anything else. An iPad by itself, it's, light, pleasant, but the moment you try to actually use it, the accessory pile starts forming. Keyboards, trackpads, pencil stands, hubs, external storages, you name it. Eventually, you realize you've recreated a laptop. But worse, you spent some laptop money to avoid buying a laptop, and you still don't get laptop freedom. It's like ordering a burger and realizing that the bun is sold separately. Apple treats accessories like optional upgrades, but functionally, they're mandatory. Without them, the iPad is limited. With them, the iPad exposes how limited it still is. That paradox has always defined the iPad, but now it has a new, much bigger problem. But before we get into that, let's address the old problem: accessories to make your iPad usable. Part of the reason this conversation even exists is that the iPad lives and dies by its accessories. On its own, it has potential. With the right gear, it becomes usable. And honestly, that's where companies like ESR come in. If you're going to buy into the iPad ecosystem, you might as well do it without paying the Apple tax for every single piece. ESR sent over their magnetic case, their keyboard case, and their digital pencil with Find My support. These accessories don't magically turn it into a Mac. They just make the iPad better at being an iPad. The magnetic case is exactly what I want from a daily case. It snaps on cleanly, doesn't feel bulky, and actually stays put. You still get that lightweight tablet first feel, which matters when you're not trying to cosplay productivity all day. The keyboard case is where things get more interesting. It's sturdy, the keys are genuinely comfortable to type on, and the trackpad doesn't feel like an afterthought. It makes writing, email, and general work on the iPad far less annoying, which is kind of the bar here. And the standout for me is the ESR digital pencil. It has Find My support, which should honestly be mandatory for any stylist at this point. If you ever lost a pencil in your couch, backpack, or the void between dimensions, you already know why this matters. It charges reliably and just works without making you think about it. What I like about ESR's approach is that it acknowledges reality. The iPad needs help, and these accessories don't fix Apple's software limitations, but they do make living with them a whole lot more tolerable. If you're already committed to using the iPad, this is the kind of setup that makes sense. Practical, well-built, affordable accessories. Links are in the description if you want to check them out, and shout out to ESR for sponsoring this video. So, Apple is preparing a device that threatens the iPad's entire reason for existing. According to the most consistent reporting, Apple's foldable iPhone will unfold into a display roughly the size of an iPad mini, a near tablet-sized screen, and a more square aspect ratio that still folds down into a phone. And the reason why that's such a big deal is because the iPad exists largely because phones couldn't become tablets. A foldable solves that problem in one move. or fold rather. If your phone can expand into a tablet whenever you need more space, the need for a separate in-between device starts to disappear. Media consumption is already covered, reading and browsing are covered, messaging, note-taking, light productivity, all covered. Basically, anything that doesn't absolutely require a full desktop operating system or an Apple Pencil gets absorbed into a device you already carry with you at all times. And unlike the iPad, a foldable phone doesn't need to justify itself with accessories. It starts as a phone, the most trusted, flexible device Apple makes, and then grows from there. The iPad starts as potential and asks you to finish the job. Now, to be fair, multitasking on the iPad is better than it's ever been, but it's still conditional. Windows behave differently depending on context, apps refresh when they shouldn't, and background tasks still disappear. You're always aware that the system is managing you, not the other way around. It's multitasking, but supervised multitasking. And this is where the iPad's biggest flaw really shows itself. Apple keeps shipping absurdly powerful chips inside it, but iPadOS politely asks them to calm down. The performance is there, the battery life is there. The one thing that's missing is the freedom, and that limitation has always been intentional. The iPad isn't allowed to replace a Mac because Apple still wants you to buy a Mac, but the iPhone doesn't have that problem. The iPhone is Apple's most important product. It gets the most attention and the most trust. If Apple gives the iPhone a foldable display that reaches into tablet territory, it can quietly absorb much of what the iPad does without ever calling it a replacement. The iPad just slowly stops being necessary, and that puts the iPad in a very dangerous position. It can't outflex a Mac, and it can't outportability a phone, and it can't justify its price, especially when accessories are involved. So it gets pushed into niches. Artists? Sure. Kids? Why not? All valid use cases. Neither of them requires yearly updates though. And yet, Apple updates the iPad every year like it's a critical pillar of the lineup. New chips and marketing language about workflows and creativity. But for whom? Those iPads sold today are nowhere near their performance limits. The hardware is so far ahead of the software that upgrades feel theoretical. It's not innovation when you're replacing the engine in a car that's still locked in first gear. That's not congratulatory. The reality of the situation is this. The iPad isn't failing. The iPad is frozen. Apple doesn't want it to win or lose. It wants it to sit safely between products, selling well enough and causing no disruption and never threatening the rest of the lineup. The iPhone Fold, though, shakes up that equation because if Apple successfully merges phone and tablet into one device, the iPad loses its most important justification. But there is a silver lining, because if the iPad is finally forced to compete for relevance, Apple will have to decide what it actually wants it to be. Either the iPad evolves into a true, unapologetic, large-screen computer, or it quietly fades into being a luxury niche device. Even more so, I guess. Which is sad, because the potential makes it so much more. But the iPhone Fold isn't the end of the iPad. It's the moment Apple can no longer avoid answering the question it's been dodging for over a decade. What is the iPad supposed to be? Well, I got nothing. What do you think it is? Let me know in the comments. If you'd like to support the Patreon, the link is below. And come join the squad along with my Ride and Ryan Pro subscribers, Vasco, Francisco Beck, and Miss Game. Thank you all for the support as it keeps me dropping videos consistently. And thank you, viewer, for watching. If you want to see more of me, you know what to do. Sorry for the lack of uploads lately, but we're locking back in. I got a bunch of new content coming, so be sure to look out for it. Now, who's getting the iPhone Fold? I heard it's like $2,000, but my point still stands.